Yes, my name is Chiara Shea, and I recently completed a doctorate at King's College London, exploring Ashbery's work in relation to the concept of spatial theory. So I'm very happy to be here today and to open this next session, which is devoted to one of the figures who has come to be known as belonging quite prominently to the first generation of the New York School, John Ashbery. And my intention is to offer a brief introductory, exploratory kind of consideration of the relationship between the Ashbery and the idea of the New York School itself, which is perhaps best summarized as complicated and ambivalent. So, if you Google the New York School of Poets, which I'm sure we've all done at some point or other, one of the first things that actually comes up is, how do you write a New York School poem? And a question which I'm sure for many of us here today would find a bit surprising, given the variety of the poetry produced by those associated with it. However, in a 2012 issue of Jacket 2, the American poet and educator Tom Donovan actually sought to answer this question by providing a list of 23 ingredients which he suggested made up the basic recipe for writing a New York School poem. So, rather than earnestly suggesting a standard template for New York School poetry, Donovan's list was primarily composed as a form of writing exercise for his creative writing students, and his suggestions range from the inclusion of references to art and pop culture, to the use of specific place names in and around New York City, to my own personal favorite, item 6, a moment when you call into question at least one thing you have said or proposed throughout your poem so far. However, while this is all undoubtedly somewhat tongue-in-cheek, it does also raise the question of how do we talk about the New York School of Poets when their work is traditionally viewed as having very little in common in regards to both substance and style. So, when asked to represent something called the New York School of Poets at New York's Poetry Now Symposium in 1968, Ashbery not only voiced reservations about his own affiliation with the so-called group, but admitted that he didn't really understand what the name actually meant. After a decade spent living in France, he felt as if he'd returned to America only to be told that not only was the New York School now a thing, but that he specifically was a part of it. Or as he explained it, the term New York School of Poets was thought up by someone, I don't know who, during a 10-year period I spent in Europe, with the poet maintaining that people invent these labels and later tell you that they apply to you, before proceeding to turn to you and ask what it all means. Given Ashbery's notorious, long-standing resistance to categorization, this is just an early example of his complicated and often conflicted relationship with the idea of a New York School of Poets. And this is also something which has the potential, in my case did have the potential, to make exploring his work in relation to the school and those associated with it equally complicated. Indeed, some critics actually actively advocate against considering Ashbery in connection with the New York School, and major figures such as Harold Bloom have actually gone so far as to maintain that his work can only be misunderstood in this context. Alternatively, there are others who primarily explore Ashbery in connection with other artists and writers of the New York School, yet they often do so without acknowledging the complexities involved or addressing Ashbery's own reservations about being labeled as a New York School poet. However, whilst Ashbery claimed that he, on the whole, disliked the New York School label, his main issues with it appeared to have stemmed from two primary concerns. The first is he felt that, as labels often do, it seemed to be trying to pin him down to something, poetically. And this was a fact he found particularly puzzling due to his belief that if there was indeed one defining characteristic of the New York School, it was, paradoxically, its absence of anything like a program. Rather, whilst he acknowledged his connection to the other poets counted as belonging to the first generation of the New York School, such as Coke, Schuyler, O'Hara, Guest, et al., he maintained that they remained markedly different as poets, despite the collaborations and influences which passed between them, and were thus largely resistant to being categorized as anything approaching an actual literary movement. And indeed, according to his biographer, Karen Ruffman, Ashbery's fears that his close ties to many of the other poets associated with the first generation of the school, and his fears that they might lead him to stagnate as a poet, were actually partly responsible for his decision to leave America for France in the mid-1950s, out of a desire to regain his creative independence and escape constraining influences. So, physical exile, he believed, had the potential to provide creative distance and therefore freedom, However, it ironically appears that his place in these networks had only become solidified during his absence. For many of those involved with the first generation of the New York School, given their noted differences as poets, the relationships that they forged, both social and poetic, were spatially navigated, or appear to have been a matter of proximity. And O'Hara famously said, and attributed the group's association to a preference for the same bars more than anything else. Members divided their time between the literary bar, the San Remo, and the artists' bar, the Cedar Tavern, rubbing shoulders with the various artists and painters from whom they would eventually derive their name. And these venues became spaces of collaboration and creative exchange, which would then shape their identity as a loosely defined poetic group. It was this shared spatial context, and it brings us back to the number two ingredient in Donovan's recipe for a New York School poem, the use of place names, especially the names of places in or around New York City. However, this also brings us to Ashbery's second, and I would argue, ultimately more pertinent issue with the New York School label, its implied affiliation to New York City itself. The fact is that the New York School is a term which is built around the concept of place, to the extent that after an article was published in the Times Book Review in the mid to late 60s, the poet Kenneth Cope was reportedly contacted by someone asking for the address of the New York School of Poets because she wanted to enroll in it. However, it was this threat of being pinned down to the notion of place which Ashbery appears to have found to be the most discomforting part of his association with the school itself. As he explained at that 1968 symposium, if you live in New York, you are probably not doing it because you like it or you feel it expresses you, but because it's the most convenient place. One has no feeling of living somewhere. That is another reason I dislike the New York School term, because it seems to designate a place, whereas New York is really an anti-place, an abstract climate, and I'm not prepared to take up cudgels to defend such a place, particularly, he griped, when he would much rather be living in San Francisco. This characterization is reminiscent of the New York of self-portrait of convex mirror, which Ashbery described as merely a logarithm of other cities rather than a place in its own right. And the fact is that this places Ashbery in a somewhat uneasy position, in that he is seen as not only integral to an account of New York school poetry, but of New York poetry and of that city's poetic culture. Yet he paradoxically asserted that, unlike contemporaries such as O'Hara, his own poetry had very little to do with New York, which he viewed as merely a convenient place to live rather than a specific place whose local colour influences the literature produced there. However, rather than detract from its capacity to serve as a medium or subject to art, Ashbery later stated that it was actually this very quality of indistinctiveness which he believed made New York such a good place to write poetry in the first place. When asked by David Hurd in a 1994 interview for the PM Review, how important has New York been as an occasion and setting for your poetry, Ashbery responded that it certainly hadn't in the Frank O'Hara sense, with Ashbery having suggested that for O'Hara, the life of the city hums through his poetry, a scent of garbage, patchouli, and carbon monoxide, which made it representative of the lovely, corrupt, wholesome place New York is. By contrast, Ashbery suggested that for him, New York's particular poetic appeal lay in what he viewed as its overarching lack of character. He said, "I find it a good place to write poetry in because it is such a large space. There is not much to distract the eye. It's a sort of benignly neutral place to write in, a sort of disposable environment." So, despite his ambivalence towards New York, in the city, Ashbery nevertheless found a good analogy for poetry itself, stating that people are always bemoaning the fact that New York is so transitory, but on the other hand, that's the way life is, and poetry has to keep changing. So, what does that mean for those of us who wish to consider Ashbery in both a New York school context and a New York City context? I would argue that rather than rejecting these contexts because of the complexities involved, it makes more sense to integrate them into the discussion, to use those complexities to help inform our understanding, because these are the very things that give Ashbery's characterization of these relationships and spaces life and meaning. Simply put, in acknowledging the ambivalence which Ashbery displays towards both New York and the idea of a New York school, we can feasibly enrich our understanding of Ashbery the poet. After all, whilst he did often voice his resistance to labels, he did understand the need for them, and of the need for a terminology which one can use without having to repeatedly explain all the reasons why it may be unsatisfactory. As he reflected, maybe it's wrong for things to get so complex that a label can't do them any sort of justice. And in my own personal opinion, it is even arguable that Ashbery's characterization of New York City as a large, neutral space presents it as perhaps the most appropriate metaphor for both his own work and the nature of the New York School in general. A wide, open terrain which allows for an endless number of possibilities. Or, as Ashbery's fellow New York School associate, the painter Grace Hartigan phrased it, there's a time when what you're creating and the environment you're creating it in come together. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone very much for their attention, and I look forward to the discussion.